Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to We're Going Viral, where we dive deep into some of the world's most renowned pathogens. I'm Samantha.
I'm Helen.
And I'm Khalid.
Today, we're taking a dive into one of the world's most known pathogens, one that has been around and will stay around.
That's right. We're diving into H1N1, a virus that goes by many names and has done everything from shut down schools to cause a global pandemic.
Or, in other words, the biggest viral drama queen anyone has ever seen.
We're going to cover everything from its biology, history, and impact.
And maybe even some fun facts along the way. For our first segment, we are going to start with what this virus actually is. Because when you go by almost 10 different names, sometimes it's hard for people to know the real you.
You're so right. So let's talk about it. H1N1 is a subtype of the alpha influenza genus and belongs to the Orthimoxoviridae family and is under the order of Articulae virales.
H1N1 specifically stands for hemagglutinin neuraminidase.
But you've probably heard of H1N1 be referred to as just influenza A or the flu.
Seems like this virus has quite the reputation.
Yeah, you could say that again.
Now that we know what the virus is, let's talk about us, the hosts.
Well, not just us, as H1N1 is something called a zoonotic virus. This means that it is able to infect more species than just humans.
Yeah, with H1N1, it has the capabilities to infect mostly pigs, poultry, and humans. This is partially what makes it such a dangerous disease. Infecting multiple species and having species to species transmission creates a breeding ground for recombination and mutation, causing new viral characteristics.
You're exactly right. And that's what we see in the 1918 and 2009 pandemic, and why over 561 million people total were infected, which we will detail later in this podcast.
Yeah, it's like constant networking for viruses, and H1N1 doesn't ever stay in a social circle like it should.
So, moving on, I know we've all had a cold at some point in our lives. So let's talk about how H1N1 is set apart from just a head cold.
Yeah, that's a good idea. But to understand what makes H1N1 so unique, you need to know its life cycle and how it transmits from one person to another.
Right. So H1N1 is an enveloped spherical virus covered in glycoproteins like hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. These help to act and look like spikes, which bind themselves to host cells.
Exactly. And once they attach, endocytosis occurs and the virus is able to enter the host cell.
Once in the host cell, viral proteins locate and enter the cell's nucleus. When they enter, RNA dependent RNA polymerase is able to initiate the synthesis of viral RNA. To do this, RNA polymerase II binds to the host DNA to start transcription.
Yeah. And the host carries out transcription and translation, which allows for the virus to be replicated. After this replication, the new viral particles leave the nucleus and use the host's plasma membrane to form virions, which leave the host cell to go infect others.
This all happens extremely fast and is part of why this flu is so dangerous. Because once host cells become infected, that host is able to transmit the virus.
Let's go over how this flu is transmitted. Like a lot of common ailments, H1N1 spreads primarily through respiratory droplets. This includes coughs and sneezes. When someone inhales these droplets, they can be infected. It can also live on surfaces, and when someone touches them and their noses, mouth, or eyes, they can also become infected.
Everyone knows of the flu and has probably heard at some point in their lives the term flu like symptoms. That comes from the general list of symptoms that usually accompanies a sickness like this one. So let's chat about it.
While we all know the obvious symptoms the flu can cause, such as fever, chills, muscle aches, cough, sore throat, fatigue, diarrhea, etc., there is more to the virus than that. People who are immunocompromised or have had previous health issues are at greater risks for pneumonia or even death.
Those are the impacts on a human. But as a group and as a society, let's talk about the numbers.
While we will talk about the specific pandemics that H1N1 has caused later in this podcast, let's do a brief overview of infection and mortality rates throughout history.
You may or may not have heard of the different pandemics that this flu has caused, so here's a quick rundown. In 1918, the first major outbreak causing a pandemic was recorded of H1N1, occurring during World War I. Then, in 1977, there was another pandemic causing outbreak. Notably, the most recent of them all was the 2009 pandemic, which caused global spread and is the last major global outbreak that has been recorded of H1N1. Not to say it can't happen again.
Yeah, and those three major outbreaks saw record numbers of cases and even deaths due to this flu. Most notably, in 1918, 3% of the entire world's population passed away due to the pandemic, and a third of the population, about 500 million at the time, got infected.
While numbers like that had never been seen again, in the 2009 pandemic, approximately 61 million people were infected just in the United States. Mortality rates mostly being caused by elderly, newborns, and immunocompromised.
So now that we know what H1N1 is, how it affects the body, and how many people are affected in major events, we should talk about how often it is actually infecting people.
That's a good point. Let's talk about it and whether or not another major pandemic is something we should worry about.
Let's start with this. We all know that H1N1 is not rare. It has had one of the biggest historical impacts we have ever seen in terms of a virus, considering its frequency and impact.
Exactly. To start, I know we've already touched on it a little bit, but let's talk more in depth about the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. This was caused by one of the earlier strains of H1N1 and infected about a third of the population, with a death toll of about 50 million. This is more than both world wars combined.
Yeah, and what made this pandemic so unique was who it was infecting. While we typically outline flu viruses as infecting newborns and the elderly, this particular pandemic infected primarily young, healthy adults.
And then, approximately 60 years later, another pandemic sized outbreak occurred, the 1977 Russian flu.
This flu was deemed eerily similar to the 1918 flu pandemic and had large levels of speculation that it was from a lab accident or viral stock kept in a lab. This pandemic similarly affected mostly young, healthy adults, avoiding older generations, possibly due to immunity left from 1918.
While we don't know the exact number of cases due to the 1977 pandemic or the exact death toll it took, we do know that it was in large enough proportions to reach a pandemic sized outbreak.
The most current and probably most known pandemic of all of the H1N1 outbreaks is the 2009 swine flu pandemic. This was caused by a newer hybrid strain of H1N1, possibly from breeding in pigs, which acts as a mixing vessel for viruses.
Yeah, and this pandemic ended up spreading so fast and so much within the first 12 months that approximately 24% of the world's population had been infected, with about a half a million deaths. This strain had been particularly nasty due to its ability to transmit very easily from person to animal or from animal to person. It attacked mainly children and young adults, as the elderly had been seen with some levels of immunity.
This strain did not just die out either, as it now regularly circulates as one of the main flu strains that appears seasonally.
H1N1 has shown that it can go the distance, being the cause behind three major pandemics and is prevalent in seasonal flu outbreaks. It is the flu strain that refuses to retire.
So, H1N1 is just like an 80s band that keeps on going on tour. And just when you think it might be over, it's back again and somehow still contagious.
After looking at H1N1's track record, it's no doubt that scientists have been trying to understand it for decades.
That brings us to our next discussion. How do scientists study this virus?
In comparison to bacteria or fungi, Viruses are a little trickier to study in a controlled and purposefully manipulated way. Because they technically aren't considered cellular life and cannot be tested on using common practices like agar or Koch's postulates, etc., it makes them a bit of a mystery.
Right. So, typical growth media like agar and broth cannot be used to grow and manipulate it. Instead, scientists have had to be creative. They've used chicken egg or cell cultures depending on what conditions were ideal for the virus and its strain.
Exactly. So if a virus originated and reproduced well in avian species, chicken eggs would be ideal to use to study the virus. And if a virus originated and reproduced in swine or humans, a mammalian cell culture would be most likely best.
With these cultures, there are also several other methods to study this virus. To study H1N1 specifically, scientists use clinical diagnoses to confirm symptoms, serology to check for antibodies, PCR and gene sequencing to perform genetic analyses, and cultures.
So, essentially, a research entourage.
Yeah, we knew that would happen since H1N1 had quite the reputation already. But how did it all start? What happened with it before it had a regular place in our regular flu season lineup?
Let's start with where it originated. H1N1 was first referenced in 1918 in a Kansas military camp, contrary to what its name signifies. This is where the first cases were found and spread amongst the military and surrounding civilians.
What spread this so fast was the constant military movement due to the First World War. It was able to rapidly reach global levels in little time.
What made the entire pandemic so interesting was that while it had reached global levels by originating in the United States, it was deemed the Spanish flu due to Spain being one of the only countries at the time to not censor war news as heavily, and as a result, Spain became the only country massively reporting on the flu.
Then fast forward to 1977, and this H1N1 flu pops up again and is deemed the Russian flu. What is so intriguing about this pandemic is that although deemed a new name, the strain seemed almost identical to a strain that had been kind of around in the 1950s.
Because this was so peculiar for a virus like this to be almost identical decades later, it caused some suspicions that the 1977 pandemic was due to a lab leak.
Yeah, because it was so similar to previous strains, infecting younger, healthy adults and mostly sparing the elderly due to some built up immunity.
The history of H1N1 is kind of like a mystery, never knowing the true origins and consistently misleading through name.
Let's talk about viral sickness. Not actual sickness, but rather a type of infection a virus can acquire, a phage. Virophages are a type of phage or virus that is able to infect other viruses.
Yeah, but this isn't known for any flu viruses, including H1N1. So there's nothing that can make the virus itself sick or infected.
So its biggest threat isn't even something that it can defend against or prevent, it's mutation. A mutation or anything that causes loss of function would be the only proven thing to actually alter or inhibit its abilities.
Even though these random chance events can happen, H1N1 has proven it can withstand the test of time, and boy, has it ever.
Let's talk about the impacts this virus has made, outside of symptoms and illness, because it definitely has left its mark.
Right. We all know the health issues it causes, all the people is infected, but what about how much money this virus has costed and continues to cost?
Great point. It definitely has not been cheap. In the 2009 pandemic alone, the United States spent over $6 billion. This does not include individual medical costs during that time, but only pandemic response. It also fails to include further research that went into the response, prevention, and overall research.
That number increases greatly when you think about the number of cases there were, hospitalizations, and even deaths.
The research after the pandemic hit has majorly been focused on limiting those costs along with hospitalizations, cases, and deaths. There is a universal vaccine in research that could help to save over $3 billion in direct flu related medical costs. And in 2019, Congress approved $130 million to go towards that research. They've also approved over $1 billion to go over 5 years in the Flu Vaccine Act.
While the economic impacts were steep, the social ones were too. trust was affected by this pandemic through censorship, war, and media. Due to the creation of the name Spanish flu, social inequalities arose. The Spanish were seen as targets in this time period, and violence ensued.
So, while most people like to focus on the economic and health impacts of this pandemic, social impacts are also a factor that must be looked at and studied.
One of the positives that has come out of making this virus a priority, as well as its constant presence throughout history, the world, and today, is that it's really well studied.
Yep, there are tens of thousands of literature pieces just on H1N1 alone.
Even crazier is that there are over 300,000 known nucleotide genome sequences in the NCBI database.
It is incredibly well studied. However, there are still some mysteries scientists are trying to figure out.
Yeah, like how some people can present as asymptomatic while others have severe health issues when infected, or how even certain mutations affect vaccine effectiveness, and what that looks like in terms of evolution.
Something else that scientists are actively trying to figure out that is not currently known are the long term effects and immunity, and if we should be worried about a future large scale outbreak.
While these questions remain a mystery, continuous efforts to further our knowledge on virus continues.
So, that is our deep dive on H1N1, a virus that has made quite the name for itself, part in history and part in mystery.
Before we leave you, we want to give you some cool facts about this virus that weren't included in the podcast.
The first being H1N1 made scientists fall in love with ferrets. Not in a literal sense, but ferrets have been found to be the best model organism to study the virus.
Another fact is that the virus is a master of disguise. Again, not in a literal sense, but H1N1 is fully able to undergo antigenic shift and drift, meaning its genome can constantly change.
And that's where we'll end it. Thanks for listening and stay curious.